From the Edge Media Studios in downtown Indianapolis, this is Indiana Issues. Here's your host, Abdul-Hakim Shabazz.
Hello, and welcome to Indiana Issues. I'm your host, Abdul-Hakim Shabazz, the editor and publisher of IndianPolitics.org, coming to you from the Edge Media Studios in downtown Indianapolis. Well, the political news tends to slow down a little bit in the summer months, so we decided to give our panel the day off. And instead, we're going to be talking about Indiana's business climate, as well as how well Indiana's doing when it comes to its African-American population. So join us to start our conversation is our good friend Kevin Brinegar of the State Chamber of Commerce. They represent the businesses across Indiana. Kevin, my friend, as always, thank you very much for stopping by and being one of our guests on Indiana Issues.
Good to see you. Thank you so much for having me.
Normally when Kevin and I chat with each other, folks, it's a recorded conversation. So this time it's just a little bit, now there's visual and video attached to it.
That's too bad for your viewers.
So let's go ahead and get started, my friend. How would you sum up how business is doing in Indiana these days?
I think overall very, very well, with a asterisk of considerable concern about the tariffs that are being imposed and or being proposed, particularly with respect to China, because Indiana exports $1.1 billion a year in manufactured goods and agricultural products to China each year, and the prospect of having a 25% tax added onto that is a concern. But generally speaking, our unemployment rate has been consistently below the U.S. average. It's been consistently about 1% below all of our surrounding states. It was a great legislative session for the chamber and the business community. Many positive things that will move the state forward. We've maintained balanced budgets and we'll maintain our AAA credit rating. So generally speaking, things are good. The biggest thing we hear, not surprisingly, is the difficulty that employers are having finding skilled employees, given this 3.4 to 3.6% unemployment rate.
Well, let's start, my friend, first of all, with the issue of tariffs. As we record this conversation, obviously there's a Chinese tariff situation that has people worried, and now the president talking about 5% tariffs on Mexican products up to
and
escalate up to 25%. How does something like that affect Indiana? Because some people may say, well, I live in Indianapolis, or I live in South Bend, or Goshen, or Richmond. How does a tariff on a Mexican or Chinese product impact me?
Well, two different situations, at least for now. The Chinese tariffs we're expecting will be reciprocal. So one, the cost of those goods coming into Indiana will go up. That may cause Hoosier consumers either A, to pay more or look for comparable products made either in America, which wouldn't be a bad thing, or other countries that are not subjected to those tariffs. But it's not good for our employers and ultimately for employment in Indiana when you talk about adding a 25% tax or price increase onto our goods. That means that consumers in China, whether they be individuals or businesses who are taking products and integrating them in to their goods or using them in their processes, will also begin to change behavior and look for comparable products manufactured in other countries or food products from other countries. That in turn will reduce demand for that $1.1 billion that we ship over to China every year, which could then in turn impact production levels and ultimately employment levels here in Indiana.
Let's talk about employment. Speaking of employment, Indiana, as you stated just a few moments ago, has a very low unemployment rate, 3.4, 3.5%, lower than all the states in the Midwest. And while that's good news, like you said, it also brings some challenges with it.
Yeah, I mean, it's better than the 11% unemployment rate we had 10 years or so ago and over 20% in certain counties, but it is still a challenge nevertheless. And it puts emphasis on workforce training, and we help support legislation that doubled the governor's next level training funds for both employers and employees. Also looked at legislation that will allow employers to have access to student transcripts with permission of the student and their parents, so they can see what CTE courses they've had and what skills they might have to bring to their employment level. So this is a big focus. It's number one priority for the governor, as it should be, and it's a number one priority for the chamber. We're going to be hosting a workforce summit in October, and we're ramping out our Institute for Workforce Excellence and developing a clearinghouse for employers and even individuals to find information quickly and efficiently about where training programs are and how to improve skills and where to find people that have those skills.
You're watching Indiana Issues. I'm Abdul-Hakim Shabazz, the editor and publisher of IndyPolitics.org. Our guest today is Kevin Brinegar from the State Chamber of Commerce, doing something a little different today, giving our panel the day off because it's the summer months, and so we're kind of exploring some more issues in a little bit more detail than usual. Kevin, I know one of the things that has always been an issue for a lot of employers has been the issue of drug testing and whether employees can come on the job, but we've been hearing because of this employee work shortage that some employers, to the point where they can, are actually sort of saying, hey, if you can avoid not doing X, Y, Z for a few days, don't do it so you can at least pass the drug test.
I don't know about that, but many employers are still drug testing. Some are relaxing them, and I've seen, and this is a little bit concerning, driving by plants last summer with signs out that said, now hiring, we do not drug test. We don't recommend that because that can lead to workplace injuries and accidents. But a preferred approach would be to provide assistance to applicants or employees who fail drug tests, applicants to say, if you've got the skills we need, we'll send you to a treatment program, you pass that successfully, and we'll have a job waiting for you. And that's something that a company over in Richmond, Belden, has done, and it's being emulated elsewhere throughout the state. The Chamber has got into this in a big way through our Indiana Workforce Recovery Initiative. We've developed toolkits for employers to provide information to their employees about how not to get addicted, to help supervisors identify when somebody has a problem, and to help employers look at their policies because the days of, okay, Abdul, you failed the drug test, you're out of here, next man or next woman up, really can't operate that way in a 3.6% unemployment environment. So employers are taking a look at that and saying, well, Abdul, you still have the skills that we need, but we need to get you some assistance. We need to recognize that this addiction is a disease. And, if we can help you get clean and sober, then you can continue to be a productive employee for our company. So a lot of changes there, and people interested in this information can go to the Chamber's website and look up Indiana Workforce Recovery.
I know one of the other things, too, that has been something that the Chamber pushed during session was not as successful, and now to also being tried at the federal level with Senator Todd Young, is raising the age for tobacco access from 18 to 21. And you and I have talked about this before. Yeah. One of the things you hear is that, hey, I'm 18 years old, I'm an adult, I can vote, I can join the military, I can get married, sign a contract. Why not allow me to smoke a cigarette?
Well, that's really the military argument in particular is specious, and I would obviously folks can go fight and die for their country at age 18, but they're not allowed to legally drink. So there are exceptions to that. And the fact is the military is going smoke-free. Entire military bases, if you sign up for the Army now and you're already a smoker, you've got to detox before they'll even let you go through basic training. You will not be allowed to smoke during basic training because the military has realized that a non-smoking armed forces is a healthier, better prepared armed forces. Plus they realized, and we heard this from testimony from two different retired generals, that they woke up and realized they were spending billions of dollars on smoking-related illnesses and diseases from their current armed forces and as well as their retirees. We also have a challenge with vaping. It's rampant in the schools, and year over year it increased 78% among teenagers. And a study that was published in the Wall Street Journal near the end of session found that within 16 months after starting vaping, 40% of the teenagers who begin vaping have moved on to cigarettes. And we know nicotine is incredibly addictive, and that quitting smoking and vaping, for that matter, is a very difficult thing to do.
I know.
So better not to start, and raising the legal age is one of the key ways, as well as raising the tax on smoking and tobacco and vaping products as well, are clearly proven effective ways to reduce smoking and vaping.
Why has it been so difficult to get the cigarette tax raised here in Indiana, do you think?
I think part of it is that our elected leaders, particularly fiscal leaders, are looking at it through the wrong lens. They're looking at it through the lens of the revenue it will raise. A $2 pack cigarette tax increase would raise $500 million a year, and saying, oh, maybe this is an ace we want to keep in our pocket until we really need it, maybe when there's an economic downturn, rather than looking at it through the lens that the Chamber and other members of the Alliance for Healthier Indiana look at it and say, this is the most effective way to reduce smoking in our state, and particularly to prevent tens of thousands of teenagers from ever becoming smokers. And it's important because our health metrics in Indiana are very poor. We have our new Indiana Vision 2025 report card out, shows that our rank among the 50 states in smoking has gone from 38th worst to 44th worst just in the last year. Our rate of smoking, percentage of population smoking, actually went up about 1%. We're 50% higher in our smoking rate than the average of the 50 states. And these policies that we're putting forth with the Alliance are proven effective ways to deal with it, but they're just not ready to, quote, raise a tax yet. And we need them to make that part of the policy platform, along with raising the age.
We got just a couple minutes left, and I want to talk about the Indiana Vision 2025 plan that I have up here on my iPad. Overall, I said the mission has always been to make Indiana sort of a global leader of economic opportunity and where citizens prosper. Overall, for 2025, what does Indiana need to do to get there? Well,
we need to continue our efforts at skilling up our adult population, our adult workforce. In that plan is a goal to have 60% of all Hoosiers have a recognized post-secondary credential, either bachelor's degree, associate's degree, or industry-recognized certificate. We're at 43%. We've been moving up since this plan was produced in 2012, but we still have a long way to go. I mentioned the health metrics, not only the smoking, our obesity rate, we're 39th worst in the country, and our obesity rate just in the latest measurement went from 31% to 34%. We're 50% higher than the number one state, Colorado. Although with legalized marijuana, their rank may change over time as folks decide to pass on that hike in the mountains or just do pizza. Or just do pizza or brownies or whatever. This people ask, why does the business community care about this? Why does the chamber care about this? Smoking in Indiana costs Hoosier businesses $6.2 billion a year in higher healthcare costs, absenteeism, and lost productivity. That's $6.2 billion that could but does not go into wages, salaries, benefits, training, and plant modernization and equipment to stay competitive in a global environment that is instead kind of flushed down the toilet. Final question for you, my friend. What's going to be the Chamber's priorities over the course of the next 6 to 18 months? Continue emphasis on workforce and skilling up our workforce, preparing our young people as best we possibly can. We'll be back knocking on the door with regard to the health metrics, particularly the smoking, and release that. And then we'll want to look at continuing the fiscal prudency and finding ways to invest as much of our state budget as possible in workforce training, education, economic development. All right. Our guest today has been our good friend Kevin Brinegar, the State Chamber of Commerce. Kevin, my friend, as always, thank you very much for being with us and being a guest on our Indiana Issues television program. Thank you. My pleasure. This has been a nice experience. And when we come back, we will talk to Marshawn Wolley. He's a columnist and lecturer in Indianapolis about the state of African Americans here in Indiana. You're watching Indiana Issues. I'm Abdul-Hakim Shabazz. We'll be right back.
And welcome back to Indiana Issues. I'm Abdul-Hakim Shabazz, the editor and publisher of IndyPolitics.org. We're coming to you from the Edge Media Studios in downtown Indianapolis. Well, as we mentioned, we're giving our political panel a break. They've been working pretty hard, these past few months, and so today we're doing something a little different, exploring some issues in more detail. Sit down with one-on-one conversations. Joining us is my good friend Marshawn Wolley. Marshawn is a columnist for the Indianapolis Recorder and also a lecturer at IUPUI, and talks about a number of issues impacting Indianapolis as well as the rest of the state. So, Marshawn, my friend, thank you very much for stopping by.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm a pleasure to be here.
Hey, welcome to our illustrious studios here.
Yeah, nice digs.
At Edge.
Nice digs.
So question I had for you, part of me why I asked you to come on is the state of African Americans here in Indiana. It's something you write about quite a bit in your column in the Indianapolis Recorder. How are African Americans doing?
So I guess since this is a political talk show, going back to the last General Assembly, the last session, there were a couple big wins that I think that came out of that. One of them, probably less noticed, was a traffic amnesty bill. That bill is going to help with folks that maybe, for whatever reason, they don't have a driver's license. That's going to help get some folks back to work. I think that's going to have an impact on folks that are experiencing that barrier. But the other piece that got a lot of attention, but wasn't necessarily people didn't actually see it as an African-American issue per se, was the hate crimes law. I was one of the folks that wrote about, the challenges with the hate crimes bill. But one of the big things that comes out of just any kind of hate crimes legislation is that roughly 60% of any hate crime that happens both federally and even those numbers kind of play themselves out in Indiana as well, are going to be race-based hate crimes. And the majority of that 60% is going to be targeted towards African Americans. And so while, there are various criticisms of the current hate crimes law that we got passed, I have my own, concerns and reservations. The most important thing is, one of the most important things is that once that bill was signed, there were now protections that were put in place. Now, while some folks are excluded, and I think folks are going to come back this next legislative session and continue to advocate for that, that was an important development. So that's what's going on in the General Assembly. But the other thing that I've been looking at, which has really kind of been an interesting development, and I think it's really in response to just the Trump era and the environment, is you're seeing more African Americans run for political office. We had several African Americans run for the mayor's office in a couple of cities throughout Indiana. One in particular, Muncie, first time an African American had run, and she won. So Terry Witt Bailey, former CEO of our Madam Walker Theater here locally, and I think in Muncie she was director of community development. She ran, she won. Muncie I think she probably has a pretty good shot in the general, so we may be looking at the first African-American mayor in Muncie. Going up to Elkhart, Rod Robertson, he's going to face opposition with Dave Miller, who's a two-time Republican mayor, like 2000 to 2008. So, but again, another African-American on the ballot. South Bend, they have a different situation where a number of African Americans ran. They got more African Americans on the city county council, but none of the African Americans prevailed in the mayor's race. But they got an interesting conversation going on with reparations, which is also interesting. So what does that tell you when you look at African Americans running, particularly running for elected office, and maybe in places that you don't necessarily think about, like, an Elkhart, like a Muncie? Yeah, I think you're seeing a resurgence in an interest in electoral politics. A lot of civil rights organizations have been focused on that. I know the NAACP did a major move in the early 2000s to get 1 million more people registered to vote, and I think those things are coming to fruition. Just across the state. I know even locally in Indianapolis, you had more African Americans running for city council races. And so I think what's kind of happened is people have looked at the political environment and they're saying, we don't want to face another Reconstruction. Let's get on the ballot
Okay. I think Reconstruction is probably a little bit more hyperbolic.
A little bit hyperbolic.
Our guest today is Marshawn Wolley. Marshawn is a columnist for the Indianapolis Recorder, as well as a columnist, as well as a lecturer at one of the universities here in Indianapolis. Our guest on the program today, talking about issues and sort of the state of African Americans here in Indiana. Marshawn, we just wrapped up another school year in a lot of places. We continue to have conversations about achievement gaps, graduation rates, course completion in that particular universe, in that sphere. And you and I are both in the teaching universe as well. How do you see African Americans doing? Are they making progress, or more getting degrees, more completing? Are we slowly closing that gap?
So I think if we're going to focus on the positive, I think there has been greater attention placed on the racial achievement gap. It is still a significant problem. I think it threatens the vitality of communities when you potentially have this racial achievement gap. I think it raises the question of what is a quality school when you have significant achievement gaps, both racial as well as with respect to poverty. But we're not. I think the best thing that's happened is that it's been brought to the fore by folks writing about it. I know I've written about it myself, but other people have also written about it. And I think with federal legislation, with the Every Student Succeed Act, I think there's been a greater federal focus on it. And so my hope is that we will be able to get more attention on this issue and try to figure out, okay, so what are the solutions? Because you can't just blame the schools. A lot of stuff starts at home. And so there's some responsibility and culpability there. But at the same time, I appreciate the fact that, when I send my son off to school, he's there with the teacher for 8 hours. So there's that relationship. You also have to consider, what could businesses be doing? What could the nonprofit sector be doing? What's government's role in this? And so I've had a few conversations with superintendents about this issue, and my hope is we can have an issue that's more a conversation that's thinking about children more holistically and trying to focus on the issue.
Is it, when you look at these achievement gaps and like to know the disparities, is it really race or ethnicity, or is it income? That tends to be more the driver.
So that actually is a very good question. When I'm looking at the Indianapolis data, I'm concerned about both. I'm not sure. I know, like in the past, when we've looked at standardized tests, for example, like SAT tests, things of that nature, income really didn't matter. There was still going to be that gap there. So in as much as there is a gap both from poverty as well as racial, I think I'm trying to figure out, I think a lot of folks focused on this issue are trying to figure out, okay, is a standardized test the best way to evaluate a school? If the answer is no, then what else should we be looking at? And then also, if we have this gap, what do you do to address it? I think for a long time, we've not talked about it at the level that we should. And so my hope is we'll start doing that now.
Can my friend, can we have these types of conversations? Like I said, for example, not just education and achievement gaps, but also things like job opportunities, things like criminal justice, without maybe having I won't say unpleasant, but uncomfortable conversation about some societal ills that tend to hit African American communities a little bit more disproportionately than maybe others.
Well, so I've tried to write about that too. So one of the things I wrote about recently was black male violence. And one of the challenges when you write about black male violence is first there's the data. Last year in Indianapolis, there were 159 homicides. About 103 were black males. White males only had 21. And when you look at the data, what you're seeing is a good number of those, when we know the cause or the assailant, are black on black. And so there is the issue of black males killing black males. There's also the issue of what kinds of situations are African Americans living in within their communities to where they basically the environment is basically having some kind of influence. And so I'm one of those folks that say, let's do a both and. Let's take on that personal responsibility of, having better conflict resolution. But you also have to hold, politicians accountable for the systems that we find ourselves in, social systems. So instead of blaming somebody, let's just try to figure out what the solution is.
When we hold these elected officials accountable, and this is something I heard numerous times during the recent primary, particularly not only here in Indianapolis, but also in a lot of other cities across the country, my hometown Chicago as well, is that in a lot of these African-American communities where there are challenges, the same elected officials keep going to office over and over and over again. Yeah. And unless you're willing to make sort of changes at the top, how can people realistically expect changes as we kind of go down the ladder?
Yeah, no, I've seen some of that here locally and in scanning around the state. I suspect there's some similarities. I think what's been interesting about this most recent election cycle has been, for example, the significant increase in the number of African Americans under the age of 40 running for political office in Indianapolis. Since I've been here, this last election cycle was pretty big. They weren't, for the most part, they weren't successful. There were a few folks that were successful, but for the most part, that was basically a promising sign. I think that in talking to some of the folks in the old guard and the old Democratic Party, as particularly African Americans, I think they know that there is a need for a changing of the guard, and it's just trying to figure out how best to coordinate that, how best to facilitate that. But the other reality is within the African American community, there is, particularly with the younger folks, there is less of a reverence for politics in general or the political party system. And so there's an independence there.
They're kind of like everybody else?
Kind of like everybody else. And so it'll be interesting to kind of see how that plays itself out over time. I know that there's been a lot of talk of a Black agenda. I'm a part of some national organizations where that's been a focus, where young people have been trying to figure out, okay, if this politician isn't talking about a Black agenda, then
Let me ask you in a couple minutes we got left here. Okay. What exactly is a quote-unquote Black agenda? And you're not being caught off guard because I've asked you this question.
You have. So here's the thing. If you look at any of our major African-American organizations, they're all looking at similar things. Some kind of version of like economic empowerment, some kind of version of civil rights, some kind of version of health or quality of life, some kind of version where there's a focus like on youth or family, and then maybe there's a fifth element that's different and unique to that particular institution. But when you think about inside of those issues, if you're thinking about education, for example, and actually education is one that's pretty prominent. If you're thinking about education, the racial achievement gap is my policy issue and my policy concern. Not whether or not we have charter schools versus public schools. I don't care. If the charter school or the traditional school works or fails on the racial achievement gap, my policy concern is still not being addressed. If we're thinking about economic development, I want to see minority and women-owned businesses getting opportunities, or minority businesses, Black businesses particularly, getting opportunities and advancing entrepreneurship. So I think what you have to do when you're thinking about a Black agenda is think about it from the terms of the disparity, what's the policy response to that disparity, and that becomes the policy agenda.
All right. Well, that's going to do it for this conversation. Our guest today has been our good friend Marshawn Wolley. Marshawn is a lecturer, IUPUI, and also a columnist for the Indianapolis Recorder, talking about just some of the issues facing African Americans here in the state of Indiana. Marshawn, my friend, thank you very much for joining us today on Indiana Issues, my friend. We appreciate it. Hopefully, we'll have you back and come back when we have our panel discussions throughout the year. So,
sounds good.
Thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me.
And that will do it for this edition of Indiana Issues. Thank you all very much for joining us. Special thanks to our friends down here at Edge Media Studios in downtown Indianapolis. I'm Abdul-Hakim Shabazz, the editor and publisher of IndyPolitics.org. Thanks for joining us, and we'll talk to you next time on Indiana Issues.